Welcome to the deep dive. Our job is simple. We take the most complex stacks of sources, pull out the most illuminating knowledge, and deliver it right to you, the learner, in a way that's, well, insightful and instantly useful.
And today's deep dive, it's a big one.
It really is. Our mission is to explore one of the most foundational and, let's be honest, debated texts in global history, the Quran.
Right. And the sources you provided are defined by this tension and some really rigorous scholarship. They don't just list critiques, they systematically map out the huge landscape of intellectual challenges against the Quran's claim of divine origin.
And crucially, the other side of that.
Exactly. The sophisticated, really layered responses from all these different Muslim schools of thought over, 14 centuries now?
So to make this manageable, we've organized everything around questions from four main groups. First, you've got atheists and skeptics, who are really focused on science and logic.
The Abrahamic family, so Christian and Jewish questions.
And finally, adherents of dharmic traditions, like Hindus and Buddhists. And just to be super clear, our goal here isn't to pick a winner. It's to impartially present the challenge and then the scholarly defense.
Yes. And to even begin to understand those defenses, you have to see that they flow into two major streams. First, there's the classical or traditional approach.
Okay, what does that look like?
It's intensely focused on deep linguistic analysis of the Arabic, the historical context, what they call asbab al-nuzul, and this concept of divine wisdom, or hikmah.
And this second stream?
That's the modern or reformist approach.
Right.
And it's often, dedicated to harmonizing the text with modern science, or distinguishing between a law that was for a specific time and an ethic that's for all time.
Got it. Okay, that structure helps. Let's start right where the rubber meets the road, the empirical challenges from skeptics. Things that target science and maybe what seems like outdated knowledge.
Well, the primary scientific critique, it focuses squarely on verses about human creation, about embryology. The argument from critics is that the Quran is basically just repeating anatomical or biological errors that were common at the time. Ideas from, say, Greek thinkers like Galen or Aristotle.
And they point to specific terms, don't they? Words like alaka and muga used to describe the stages of development.
Exactly. Critics say this just reflects the limits of 7th century knowledge, not divine insight.
So how does the defense handle that? This seems to be where your two streams really diverge.
It is. The classical position is all about the language. It stresses that the Quran is using phenomenological terms, words that describe what you can see or feel.
So alaka means?
It means a clinging thing, or maybe a leech-like clot. And muga means a chewed substance. These are descriptions that are accessible. The point for them is that the text is a spiritual sign of God's power, not a medical textbook.
But the modern position, they don't quite agree with that, do they? They lean into what's called the scientific miracle argument.
They absolutely do. The modern defense argues that those same verses, like 23.1214, actually align remarkably well with modern stages. Zygote, implantation, even some mite formation.
Wow.
And they'll even point to details they say were unknown then, like the Quran mentioning the creation of hearing before sight. So you get this internal tension right away.
Yeah.
Is the language meant to be poetically descriptive or scientifically precise?
And that tension leads right into the next big critique from skeptics.
The retrofitting charge.
Exactly. The idea that references to, say, an expanding universe or life coming from water are just too vague, and they only get interpreted as miracles after science discovers these things.
And this is a huge point of debate, even within modern scholarship. Someone like Hamza Zortzis will actually warn against this. He'll say, be careful about making the Quran dependent on science, because science is always changing.
That makes sense. If your proof for divinity is today's science, what happens when tomorrow's science changes?
Precisely. So they emphasize that the real primary miracle was always the classical one, Ijaz al-Quran, the linguistic inimitability of the text. That's the proof that lasts, not whether a verse matches a specific scientific theory of our time.
Okay, but if the language is meant to be transcendent and metaphorical, that brings up a really sticky point. The verse about the origin of sperm.
Ah, yes. Surah 86.
It says the fluid comes from between the backbone and the ribs. And, anatomically for an adult male, that's just not correct.
This specific verse triggers some of the most, let's say, creative and complex apologetic work.
I can imagine.
So classically, scholars like Al-Tabari would interpret the words salb for backbone and tar'ib for ribs, metaphorically. Meaning it's an idiom. It refers to the loins or just the general region of potency, the trunk of the body. The focus is on creation from a fluid, not mapping a precise anatomical duct system. It's about the source of vitality.
Okay, so the classical defense is, don't read it like a biology diagram, it's a euphemism. But what about the modern defenders, the ones who want scientific accuracy everywhere else? How do they handle this one?
And that is the core conflict, you're right. The modern embryological defense tries to have it both ways. They say it is scientifically precise, but it's talking about the embryo.
The embryo.
Yes. They argue that in the embryonic stage, the gonads, the testes or ovaries, they actually form up near the kidneys. Spatially, that's between the backbone and the ribs.
Yeah.
They only descend later.
So the claim is that it's a reference to our biological point of origin in the fetus, not the point of emission in the adult.
And that, they argue, is an embryological detail nobody could have known in the 7th century.
Fascinating. Okay, let's shift gears from empirical science to the text's own structure and ethics. A big question is, if God is all-knowing, why does the Quran have shifting rules on alcohol, for example, that require abrogation or nask? It suggests a revision.
Right. And both classical and modern schools would just universally reject the idea that God is changing his mind. They frame nask completely differently.
As what?
As progressive legislation. They call it tadrish. It's tailored to the readiness of society, and it's a sign of divine wisdom, or hikmah. It's a pedagogical method, not a correction.
The classic example being the alcohol ban.
Exactly.
Right.
It wasn't banned overnight. Early on, a verse just says, don't pray while intoxicated. Then a later one says its harm outweighs its benefit. And finally, you get total prohibition.
So it's gradual.
It's gradual. God knew the final rule from eternity, but revealed it in stages to help a society that was deeply accustomed to alcohol. It's seen as mercy, not indecision.
That reframes it as adaptation. Okay, but what about miracles? For instance, the claim that the moon was split in two, there's no empirical reproducible evidence for that.
The defense here is rooted in the very nature of what a prophecy is. They'd say a miracle is a sign for a specific people at a specific time. It's not a perpetual science experiment for future generations to test.
So the evidence is testimonial.
It is. It's in the Hadith, the reports from eyewitnesses. Some modern apologists might say it was a localized event, maybe even an optical phenomenon for Muhammad's community. But for them, the ongoing miracle, the one you can test today, is the literary challenge of the Quran itself. That ijaz.
Let's turn to some of the toughest internal critiques, the moral ones. Specifically about verses that seem to promote violence or unequal treatment of women.
And this is where that concept of asbab al-nuzul, the context of revelation, becomes absolutely mandatory for any serious scholar.
So with violence, they'd point to verses like 9.5, the so-called verse of the sword.
Yes, and they would stress that it is highly contextual. It was revealed in a specific historical moment, addressed only to certain pagan tribes who had repeatedly broken treaties and were in a state of active war.
So not a blanket command?
Not at all. It's understood as specific war law against active belligerents, and it has to be read alongside all the other verses about justice, mercy, and restraint.
And what about the rules regarding gender, which draw a lot of modern ethical critique?
Well, the initial defense is historical. The rules were, for 7th century Arabia, revolutionary. They gave women rights to inheritance, to own property, and banned female infanticide.
A major step up from the status quo.
A huge step up. But the conversation doesn't end there. Modern reformist scholars, people like Amina Wadud, they argue for something deeper. They say you have to separate the eternal ethical principles like justice, adl, from the time-bound, specific legal applications for that community.
Meaning the principle of justice is eternal, but how you apply it might change.
Precisely. And they argue that the principle of justice must guide how we interpret the text today, even if it means moving beyond the specific legal structures from 1400 years ago.
So that really seems to be the key hermeneutic, the key interpretive tool across the board.
It is. If you connect this to the bigger picture, the entire Muslim response often hinges on this, separating timeless, universal principles from time-bound, specific applications.
That's a clear methodology. Okay, let's pivot now to the theological conflicts, specifically those coming from the older Abrahamic faiths. Let's start with Christianity. The Quran denies Jesus' crucifixion and his divinity. That's a direct contradiction of the New Testament's core message.
And the denial of divinity it's the absolute foundation of the Islamic worldview. It's called Tawhid, strict, uncompromising monotheism.
Jesus is a prophet, but not God.
A great prophet, highly revered. But making him divine is seen as shirk, the one unforgivable sin of associating partners with the one God.
And the crucifixion.
The majority view is what's called the substitution theory,
Yeah.
that God protected Jesus by raising him to heaven, and it only appeared so to them that he was crucified. The idea is that God wouldn't let his beloved prophet suffer such a humiliating public death.
But then you have this other problem. The Quran affirms the divine origin of the Bible, the Torah and Injil. If it affirms them, how can it then contradict them on something so fundamental?
That's handled by the doctrine of Tarif, which means corruption or alteration. The Quran is said to affirm the original revelation given to Moses and Jesus, not the texts we have today. Muslim scholars assert that the current texts were corrupted over the centuries.
Through scribal errors, translation issues.
Exactly, human error and alteration. So the Quran, in this view, acts as the Furqan, the criterion, that judges what is still authentic in those older scriptures and what isn't. It's the divine corrective.
Got it. What about the critique that the Quran seems to misunderstand the Trinity by implying in one verse that it includes Mary?
Right, verse 5.116. Scholars have a couple main approaches here. One is that the Quran was critiquing specific regional Christian sects in Arabia at the time, like the Caliridians, who apparently did elevate Mary to a near-divine status.
So it wasn't aimed at mainstream Nicene Christianity.
Or the other view is that it's attacking the general theological concept of dividing God's oneness. From a strict monotheistic view, whether you divide God into three parts with Jesus or Mary or the Holy Spirit, it's still seen as polytheism, as shirka.
Okay, briefly then, let's touch on the Jewish critique. The Quran uses stories like Cain and Abel, but sometimes introduces polemical changes, like threatening some Sabbath breakers with being turned into apes and pigs.
The shared stories are seen as proof of a common prophetic source. The differences are seen as divine corrections. The Quran, for example, often exonerates prophets from sins attributed to them in later Jewish traditions.
And the apes and pigs.
Almost universally interpreted metaphorically. It's not a literal physical transformation. It's about a moral and spiritual degradation, a loss of their humanity and dignity because of their actions.
We've covered the Abrahamic family. That raises a really important question. How does Islam, with its strict monotheism, reconcile its claims with dharmic traditions like Hinduism or Buddhism, which are often pluralistic or even non-theistic?
The fundamental conflict is right there in the terms. It's tawhid versus what Islam would call shirk, or polytheism.
Yeah.
The Quran insists that monotheism is the non-negotiable ultimate reality. Idol worship, from that perspective, leads to superstition and social injustice.
So that seems pretty irreconcilable. Is there any attempt to build a philosophical bridge?
There is, actually, especially in more modern comparative theology. Some Sufis and scholars like Shabir Ali, they find common metaphysical ground with non-dual Hindu schools, like Advaita Vedanta.
Which posits one ultimate reality.
Exactly, an ultimate formless reality called Nirguna Brahman. So they can accept that philosophical high ground, this idea of a single ultimate reality beyond form, while still rejecting the ritualistic practice of idol worship, which they see as shirk.
So they distinguish between a philosophical monism and practical polytheism. Okay, what about ethics? How does the violence or animal slaughter permitted in Islam square with a principle like ahimsa or nonviolence in dharmic faiths?
Islam's position is that true compassion sometimes requires the use of controlled force to stop an oppressor. So defensive war is sanctioned. Total pacifism is seen as allowing tyranny to flourish.
It's a different definition of compassion.
A very different one. And with animal slaughter, it's permitted, but only under strict humane guidelines, halal, which emphasize respect for creation and avoiding cruelty. So one path emphasizes absolute non-harm, the other emphasizes justice and responsible stewardship, which can include force.
And the final, very sharp difference, eternal hell versus reincarnation, or samsara.
Yes. The Islamic view is that one life is the test. The outcome is final. Eternal punishment is framed as divine justice for those who knowingly and arrogantly reject God.
Is there any room for nuance there? It sounds very absolute.
There is a minority strand, both in classical and modern scholarship, that suggests hell might be more of a purifying process and maybe not eternal for all sinners. The idea that God's infinite mercy might eventually win out, but that's not the majority view.
So that brings us to this synthesis. We've covered so many different responses, from linguistics to embryology to metaphor. For you, the learner, trying to get your head around all this, what are the overarching methods that tie all these defenses together?
The sources show 4 constant pillars that Muslim scholars use no matter what the critique is. First, contextualization. That asbab al-nuzul, understanding the specific time and place of a revelation, is non-negotiable.
That's it.
Linguistic precision. using the incredible depth of classical Arabic metaphor, idiom, root words to interpret difficult verses. They call it ta'wil.
Okay, third is the big one we mentioned.
Yes, distinguishing principles from application, separating the timeless ethical core like justice and mercy from the specific 7th century legal rules. It's huge for modern readers.
And finally,
The literary miracle,
oh,
the ijaz, the constant refrain that the text eloquence, its complex structure, its sheer impact, that remains the core ongoing proof of its divine origin.
so what does this all mean for you, the learner? Well, these sources show that these debates are not settled history. They are alive, they are vibrant, and they are often contentious within Islamic scholarship itself.
Absolutely. We see modern scholars openly critiquing earlier apologetic trends, like the over-reliance on a very literal scientific reading, sometimes called bucailism.
And they're pushing for these deeper, more ethical readings instead. The conversation is always moving forward.
Indeed. The scholarly tradition demands that continuous engagement with the text.
And the whole discussion, really, it boils down to this profound philosophical tension. Can a text revealed in a specific historical tribal context, a text containing time-bound social regulations, can it retain its absolute universal authority when it's judged against the continuously evolving ethical and scientific standards of modernity?
That is the question.
And that tension, that balancing act between the specific and the universal, is what makes interpreting the Quran such a perennial, a vibrant, and yes, a sometimes contentious field of global study. Thank you for sharing your sources for this deep dive. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.